When Lorenzo Snow became president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1898, the church had many debts. The church owed a lot of money and had no money to pay what it owed. President Snow worried about how the church would pay its debts. He prayed many times and asked Heavenly Father to show him how the church could get the money to pay the debts. One morning, President Snow told his family that the Lord wanted him to go to the city of St. George in the southern part of Utah. It would be a long and hard trip. President Snow was very old and was not very strong. His wife and son were worried. They thought the trip would be too long and too hard for him. President Snow asked them to go on the trip with him. When they asked President Snow why he had to go, he said,
"I don't know yet why the Lord wants me to go to St. George, but I do know He wants me to go. I'm sure He will bless me with the health and strength I need to make the trip."
President Snow and his family and some of the other general authorities traveled most of the way to St. George on a train. They rode the rest of the way in carriages pulled by horses. As they traveled along the dusty roads, they saw how dry the land was. It had not rained in southern Utah for a long time. President Snow noticed that the rivers and streams had no water in them. The trees and grass were dying. Many of the cattle were dying, and some were already dead because there was no water. It was a long, hot trip to St. George. President Snow was very tired when he finally got there. He was worried about the cattle and the crops of the people who lived there, but he still did not know why the Lord wanted him to go to St. George.
The Lord has called me to St. George, but why? Why? Why have I brought so many people with me when they are needed so much at home? If the Lord would only tell me why He wanted us to come here.
The next morning, members of the church gathered at a special conference to hear President Snow speak. They all wondered why he had come to St. George and what he would say to them. When President Snow stood up to speak to the people, he was still weak and tired from the long trip. He told the people that he did not know why the Lord wanted him to come to St. George. He told them that he knew they needed rain for their cattle and crops. He said that the church needed money to pay its debts. Suddenly, in the middle of his talk, he stopped. He was very still for a moment. Then he started to speak again, with more power and strength than before.
My brothers and sisters, I understand clearly now what the Lord has sent me here to tell you. The time has come for every Latter-day Saint to pay his tithing in full from this day forward. That is the word of the Lord to every member. This is the answer to our problems. Even though we have many debts, if the members of the church will pay a full and honest tithing, we will have enough money to pay our debts. I also want to give you a promise about your dried up lands. If you people here will pay your tithing fully and honestly, from now on, you may go ahead and plow your land, plant your seed, and I promise you, in the name of the Lord, that clouds will gather, rains will fall from heaven, your lands will be watered, the rivers and ditches will be filled, and your crops will grow.
On the way home to Salt Lake City, President Snow stopped at every town and taught the people to pay their tithing. When he got home, he continued to teach that the saints everywhere should pay a full and honest tithing. The members of the church obeyed the prophet. They began paying their tithing as they should. Soon tithing money was being sent in from every ward and stake in the church. President Snow was very happy. The church was able to pay its debts. In St. George, the members of the church paid their tithing and planted their seeds as President Snow had told them to do. Then they waited for the rain he had promised them, but no rain came. Some of the saints were afraid it would not rain and their crops and cattle would all die. But other members had faith that the rains would come. They believed the things the prophet had said. Weeks passed and there was still no rain. The saints sent a letter to President Snow to tell him that they were worried. President Snow was worried too. He went to his room to pray many times.
Most Holy Lord, why was I inspired to make those promises to the good people in St. George? If the promises are not going to be kept, they were promised, dear Lord, that if they would pay tithing, thou wouldst send the rains from heaven and bless their crops. These good people are not only paying their tithing, but they are giving all they have to thee. Wilt thou please send the rain to them, as I was inspired to promise them?
Rain came at last. It filled the rivers and streams and brought new hope to the saints living in St. George. How thankful the saints were. They sent a letter to President Snow telling him that it had finally begun to rain in St. George. Their crops and cattle were saved.
Thank the Lord. Oh, thank the Lord. It's rain. They have rain in St. George.